Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Beyond Access series. Tonight, we are here again with Dr. David Schonfeld, and who's going to be talking to us about how to talk to our children about death. Also with us tonight is Mary Shaman from the DOE's Office of Safety and Youth Development. Tonight, like in every night, you all have the ability to ask your questions directly to our panelists and using the Q&A function. So please feel free throughout the presentation to add your questions to the Q&A. We've set aside some time towards the end to answer those questions. At the end of the session, you'll also receive a survey link. We'll drop it in the chat as well. And we ask that you please take a moment to take that survey. It helps us plan for future sessions. And it helps us really improve the series for all of you. So thank you all for joining. Thank you for coming and joining us for another night of social emotional learning. And with that, Dr. Schonfeld, the floor is yours.
Okay. Second. All right. Well, thank you very much. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really how do we explain death to children, and why should we actually have that conversation, and what do they need to understand in order to be able to adjust to a loss. So just remind you, we had previous sessions on how children come to understand illness and how to explain COVID-19 to them, and then how to help them cope with the distress during the pandemic. And now we'll be talking about how to help them cope with bereavement. So the first thing is we have to recognize that even prior to this pandemic, loss was very common in the lives of children. About 5% of children in our country experience the death of a parent by 16 years of age. And about 9 out of 10 children experience the death of a family member or friend by the time they complete high school. Although most children will adjust even a major loss, it doesn't mean that they don't grieve, and it doesn't mean that grieving isn't extremely difficult for them. Now, many children may not share their grief, even with their parents and other caregivers, and they may not even appear to be grieving when we are with them. There are multiple reasons for that. For one thing, adults may unintentionally communicate to children that death is just not something that's openly discussed. So if you imagine that, let's say there's a death of one parent, and we'll say in this case, it's the father that dies, and the mother sits down with the young child and says something about what had happened and explains it to the child. And then the child looks at mother and says, does that mean that daddy's not going to be home for my birthday? And you would imagine that at that point, mother would start crying. And this may actually lead children to believe that they caused their parent to cry by somehow misbehaving. And you'll find the kids, even from a very young age, will turn around and quickly state something like, don't worry, mom, we're going to be okay. I know how to fix things around the house. I know how to cook. We can do everything daddy used to do. And they'll support the parent who's actively grieving. And that may give the parent the false impression that the child has somehow adjusted to the loss. So one of the benefits of having children talk to someone outside the family, such as within the school, is that they can do so without feeling like they're going to uncover the grief of the person in the school setting. But there are many other reasons why children don't appear to be grieving. Very young children, or children with intellectual disabilities, may not yet understand what's happened, or at least understand its implications. When somebody dies, we talk about how the person loses the individual that they love, and that's considered the primary loss. But they also lose everything that person did for them or might do for them in the future, and that's called the secondary loss. Children don't anticipate all the secondary losses the same way that adults do when a death has first occurred. I remember talking to one man, his wife had died in a car accident, leaving him with 2 children. And he said he lived in dread of the day that his daughter had her first period. But his daughter was only about 5 years of age. And I assure you, she wasn't really worried about that at that point. But when that time comes, I'm sure she probably will miss her mother very acutely, but she doesn't know to anticipate that yet. So adults tend to think about everything that the death means to them now and in the future. Children grow into that loss and they may not understand that. Children who do understand, though, what's happened and understand its implications may actually then just become so overwhelmed by what they're feeling that they don't even want to talk about it, particularly in a school setting. Because they may worry that if they start to talk about it, even privately with a counselor, they're expected to somehow go back to math class shortly afterwards, and that might just feel like something they can't do. So they may decide just not to start the conversation. Children may also express their grief indirectly through their behavior or attempt to work out their feelings through play. There are many games that have death as and we've all played them with young children. There's one game that I'm sure all of you have played at one point with a child in the first couple of years of life, where people have said it's the first game about death. It's actually played in every culture in the world, and it starts in the second half of the first year of life. And so in the United States, we call that game peekaboo. So what tends to happen is when children are first born, they don't seem to remember that things continue to exist when they're out of sight. So out of sight is literally out of mind for a 3 or 4 month old. But once they start to be able to remember that things continue to exist even when you can't see them, we call that object permanence, they then are in the position where they can start to grieve permanently losing that loss. So at that point, they start playing the game peekaboo, again, starting somewhere around 6 to 9 months of age. And in that game, the child looks at someone and then they are separated as if the person has died. There's heightened concern, or at least awareness on the part of the child, and then joy at reunion. And then they play it again. And children, will play this game over and over and over again. And you have to ask yourself, why do children at the same developmental level play the same game all across the world and feel so driven to play it? And people have said, again, it's a game about death. And actually, peekaboo, when you translate it literally from Old English, means alive or dead. And that's what the game is about. And that's why they play it. There are many other games that children play where death is a theme. So some of it is that children do talk about this from a very young age, but adults aren't always aware that that's what the conversation is about. Children, though, and adolescents, and even adults may understand what's going on, be able to discuss it, but still choose not to. And they may choose to keep their losses private and not discuss their feelings with other adults, such as classroom teachers or other school professionals. In many ways, grief is a very personal experience. I did a lot of work with New York City after 9/11, and there were a number of children that made the decision with their families that they weren't going to inform the school that one of the family members had died in the World Trade Center attack, because the kids decided they didn't want to be one of the 9/11 kids. I think we'll see the same thing during this pandemic. Now, while children may feel uncomfortable, adults don't necessarily do much better. Many adults don't think they know what to say to make things better, and therefore they're often afraid they're just going to say the wrong thing and unnecessarily upset children or just make matters worse. But saying nothing actually communicates a lot to children. It communicates that the adults are unconcerned, uncaring, unable, or unwilling to be of assistance, and none of those messages are ones we want to deliver to grieving children. The silence often leaves children confused about what's happened and unsupported, and it requires them to grieve alone. So let me talk about some of the things to consider when you're talking to someone who's acutely grieving. Now, this is really when you're in a position like you're an educator, or it relates to your job, or it has to do more with a friend of yours. There are going to be exceptions when you're talking to your own children, where you might decide to discuss some of these things or speak in this way, but just consider how you approach it. So one of the things to consider is, don't try and cheer up people who are grieving by making statements such as, "I know it hurts very much right now, but I know you're going to feel better within a short period of time." Instead, allow them to express their grief and don't rush them through that process. Don't encourage them to be strong or to cover up their emotions. Now, often when people do this, it's really because it helps the observer. So if you see someone, whether that's your own child or a friend or another family member grieving, it can be painful to watch. And so if we try and cheer them up, then we feel like we've somehow helped, but really we're just getting them not to talk about what their grief is causing them to feel. And that just makes us feel better as observers. but it doesn't help them express and then deal with their grief. You should feel free to express your own feelings and to demonstrate empathy, but don't state you know exactly how others feel. Comments such as, "I realize this must be extremely difficult for you," or "I can only begin to imagine how painful this must be," can demonstrate that you're concerned and empathic. But I would avoid statements such as, "I know exactly what you're going through," because you can't really know what they're going through. You don't want to say things like, "You must be angry." Let the child or the adult express their own feelings and don't tell them how they ought to feel. You should limit the sharing of your own personal loss stories and keep the focus on the child's experience and feelings. And in the case where you're talking to your own children, you may wish to share some of your personal loss experiences. And in many situations, with the child is grieving, you are grieving as well. And then sharing some of your personal feelings about that may serve as a good model for how to express feelings for children. But I always tell educators, really, it's all about the child and their loss, and it's not a time for you to share your experiences with them. We also want to identify and address guilt reactions, and I discussed this when I was talking about the pandemic. Children tend to focus on themselves and view themselves as the center of the universe. They often have a very limited understanding of why things actually occur, and they often rely on magical thinking, as I discussed before, believing that their unrelated actions, thoughts, or wishes may cause important events in the world that are really unrelated to them. Magical thinking is often reinforced by children, by parents in their children. So I don't want to be critical here, so I'm actually going to share with you that I'm Catholic and I raised my children to believe in Santa Claus, so I really love Santa Claus. But if you raise your children to believe that Santa will somehow know if they clean their room one evening in November and be so impressed by that, he's going to go tell the elves a toy to make and put it in a sled pulled by reindeer and deliver it to the child's home in the middle of the night, later the following month, and that's somehow connected. They're cleaning their room in November is going to cause all of this to happen. That's pretty far-fetched. And if a child actually believes that to be the case, then that means that if at some point they yell at their brother, and then 2 weeks later, their brother gets cancer and dies, they may feel that's their fault. And what I would say is that's probably more logical. So the issue is when we encourage the magical thinking of kids, we make them feel much more powerful than they are. And that's great when good things happen. It's not very good when there's something tragic that occurs. So I don't think we should be, surprised that children feel guilty about loss. And this can happen even if children are given the best explanations and seem to understand. I was providing some support to a child. He was about 7, 8 years of age. His brother had died of sudden infant death syndrome, or crib death, or SIDS. His parents had done an excellent job of explaining to him what it meant. He actually was quite bright. He was able to explain it to me, and he actually had a lot of insight. I remember the first time I saw him, he actually said something to me like, "My mother's about to have another child." I said, "Yeah, she looks like she's near the end of her pregnancy." And I asked him, "What do you think about that?" And he said, "I think she's just trying to replace my brother that died." And I just asked him, "Can you do that?" And he said, "Of course you can't do that, but that's what I think she thinks." Now here the child really showed a great deal of insight. He was demonstrating really no problems that we could tell in terms of adjustment after the death of his brother. And he was very open and discussed with me, how he had felt and how it was all resolved. And so on the second visit at the end, I finally just looked at him and I asked him, "Why did your brother die?" And he looked at me and said, without even pausing, "Because I went to camp that day." So here he had gotten the explanations. He could even tell me that SIDS stood for sudden infant death syndrome. He talked about the research that was being done, or just that there was research being done to try and figure out the cause. But the reality is SIDS is death of unknown cause. And if you don't understand why something happens, you often just conclude that it's something you did or didn't do. So as I mentioned in the prior session, this can lead to guilt in children after the death of someone they know. One of the cartoons that I often show is from Calvin and Hobbes, and it's a situation where Hobbes is actually taken away by a dog, and Calvin is crying and goes to his mother to say how distressed he is and how he's lost his best friend. And his mother just says to him, well, Calvin, if you wouldn't drag that lion everywhere with you, things like this wouldn't happen. And he just ends by saying, there's no problem so awful you can't add some guilt to it and make it even worse. So please look for the guilt in children, as I talked about last time. I think it's extremely common after a death. In fact, we still have some of these same beliefs as adults, and that's why it's important to reassure both children and adults of their lack of responsibility for a death. In my first session, I talked at length about how children may misunderstand illness. The same applies to death. For young children or older children with intellectual disabilities, they may misunderstand the explanations that you give them. So for example, I remember at one point as a child myself, I think I was probably about 7 or 8, we were in the car, we passed a funeral home. And so I asked my dad, what is a funeral home? And my dad said that it was like, the funeral homes are buildings that are homes, and they often have people who have died who are placed in these homes for people, friends, and family to visit, just as they were when they were alive. And I remember I just said to my dad that he was driving at the time, of course, and I just said, that doesn't make any sense. Why would anyone want to do that? And he said, well, actually, I don't. I mean, I would prefer to be cremated. So I said, well, Dad, that's not really the question. I don't understand why you would do it. And then I just asked him, don't they run out of space? And my dad just said, well, actually, those buildings are much larger than they look like from the outside. They have a lot of different rooms, so they don't run out of space. And that doesn't even make sense to me. So I just said, I still don't understand it. And he said, again, I just would prefer to be cremated. And that was our whole conversation. Now, he was driving at the time. He wasn't able to look at me. And so it wasn't a bad explanation. But when my father said it was a home-like setting where people could go and visit with them just like they were when they were alive, I had been to a wax museum, and that's what I interpreted his comment to me. So I thought there was someone in a living room reading the newspaper, there was someone in the kitchen cleaning dishes, and people just came and visited, but he never said that they buried the bodies afterwards. And that's why I asked the question, don't they eventually run out of space? But I don't think he picked up on what I was asking. So you can imagine, you can give an explanation, which isn't that bad. Actually, I thought that's a decent explanation, but kids can still get it wrong. So we have to be careful with our explanations. So for example, if you say to a child that the body is placed in a casket, some kids will actually think that means the head is placed someplace else. And that's why they don't want to look in, because they don't want to see the person with their head removed. And that isn't, of course, what you meant. So whenever children do seem to show distress after you've explained something important, it's a good time to say, why don't you tell me what you're worried about or what you think I mean by that explanation? Religious explanations can be shared with children by family members at any point, at any age, and at any developmental level, but they shouldn't be relied upon as the only explanation of the death. Attempts to place religious concepts in very simple terms are often ineffective, and they can provide little understanding of both the physical realities and the spiritual beliefs. I remember seeing one boy, he was a typically developing child. Again, he was about 7 or 8 years of age, and his brother had also died of sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, or what some people call crib death. And this had happened maybe 4 months beforehand. And he was in the clinic because he had a stomach ache. It was a walk-in clinic. I hadn't met him before, but I read in the chart that his brother had died, and I started to ask questions. His parents did not want to discuss it. And I remember they just said, that's not why we're here. He has a stomach ache. The stomach ache just started last night. It's not related to his brother's death, but I asked him more questions. I asked about his behavior. I asked about his understanding. I asked about how he was sleeping. And finally, at one point when I asked, have you noticed any change in how he behaves? They first said no, and then the mother said, well, actually, he does misbehave at church now, since you asked. And I said, what was the reason you told him his brother died? And the mother just said, well, we told him that his brother was such a good little baby, God wanted him back at his side as an angel. And I said, well, what did you tell him that church is? And they just said, well, church is God's home. And I said, well, maybe when he goes over to God's house, he doesn't want to behave well enough that God will think he should be an angel too, and also call him back. And the parents just looked at me and they said, I can't believe we gave him that explanation. And all I could think of was every time they went to church, this boy was really afraid he was going to be killed by God. And he tried to misbehave as much as possible so he wouldn't die. And his parents just yelled at him for misbehaving. So I think we just have to be cautious about some of the more religious explanations, as they may actually be confusing to children. Now, there are four basic concepts about death that children need to understand in order to understand and then cope with the death. And I'm going to go over these. They apply to all children, and that would include children who have intellectual or neurodevelopmental disabilities. One is that death is irreversible. The second is that all life functions end completely at the time of death. The third is that everything that is alive eventually dies. And the fourth is that children have an understanding of the physical reasons why someone dies. Most children understand these concepts by about 5 to 7 years developmentally. For children with intellectual disabilities, you can start by assuming they're probably close to whatever their developmental age is, as a starting point at least. But even children who are much younger can be helped to understand these concepts at earlier ages. So let me go over each of them. Children need to learn that death is irreversible. They often see cartoons and television shows where characters die and then come back to life, and children may then view death as some kind of temporary separation. Adults may reinforce this belief if they talk about someone who's died as having gone on a long journey. But if children only view death as temporary separation, they really have no reason to begin the mourning process. They may actually just be angry that the person hasn't contacted them or returned for important occasions. So understanding this concept of irreversibility allows children to begin to mourn the death. Children also need to understand that all life functions end completely at the time of death. Otherwise, they may worry unnecessarily about physical suffering of the person who's died. They may worry that the person who died is in pain, is hungry or thirsty, or afraid about being in a coffin or being buried. If you ask a child to draw a picture or write a letter to place in the casket, you need to make sure that they realize that this is symbolic. Because if you're going to put a picture for a family member in a casket, it makes sense that the child may assume the person can see it. And if they can see the picture, that means they can also see they're in a casket and can be aware that they're being buried. And that can be very frightening to kids. And so the first time I did a presentation on this topic, it was about 30 years ago, I actually was called to a school where 3 children had experienced the deaths of their parents from unrelated and natural causes. And they just wanted a presentation to talk to the kids. And I met with the 3 children as a small group before I talked with the entire class. And actually, all 3 of the children were having recurrent nightmares that their parent was trying to dig themselves out of the grave. If you think about it, all these horror stories about vampires and zombies, they all deal with these concepts. And one of the reasons they're so frightening is they deal with these universal concepts. I've actually given this talk in many different countries across the world. And whenever I ask, do you have a word for zombie or to translate vampire? I'm always surprised that they always know how to translate it. Like, it does translate into many, if not every language. So you want to make sure that children understand that all life functions cease completely, because that allows the child to be less likely to worry that the person who has died is physically suffering. Children also need to be helped to understand that everything that is alive eventually dies. Otherwise, they may believe that they or their loved ones will never die, and therefore they're confused why a particular death occurs. So if not everyone dies, then someone had to be selected to die. And as they try to make sense of that death, they may conclude that it happened because of something bad that the child did, and that leads to guilt, or it's something that the person who died did that meant they were selected or punished by being killed, and that leads to shame. Guilt and shame do not lead to a child wanting to talk about what happened. So you want to make sure that you do help them understand in very basic terms what was the reason for the death. And that gets into understanding that there are physical reasons why someone dies. If children don't understand the real cause for why a person died, they're more likely to create explanations that reinforce this guilt and shame. So you want to make sure, in brief, simple language, that you give an appropriate explanation that fits with their developmental level. You can avoid graphic details, but the idea, again, is to help minimize guilt and shame. Now, as I mentioned in our last session, children with intellectual and neurodevelopmental disabilities may face some unique challenges in the aftermath of a death. Children who can't communicate well often express, at least verbally, often express their distress in nonverbal ways, such as becoming more aggressive or may see more disruptive behavior. They may show changes in sleep, eating, or toileting patterns. Some children may increase self-stimulating behaviors, such as rocking, chewing on clothes or fingers, or just becoming more intolerant of changes in routine. So as you know, if children have autism spectrum disorder or some other neurodevelopmental conditions, routines may be very important. So efforts should be made to reestablish any disrupted routines. If the death involves a caregiver or another family member and requires a forced relocation to a new home or school setting or new caregivers, it's important to establish new and consistent routines as quickly as possible. We'd like not to disrupt them, but if the circumstances require the change, then we want to try and reestablish the new routines and make sure that they become predictable to the child. Now, I've been talking about children, some of you I know have children where their disability may be, for example, social and emotional reasons, and they may be otherwise typically developing adolescence. So although I seem to be talking about young children, I want to say that pretty much everything I've talked about applies to adolescents as well. Society often assumes that the impact of death on adolescents is somehow easier than it is for young children. Adolescents are expected to be more mature and more adult-like, and therefore better able to handle the consequences of a death. Adults often wrongly assume that because adolescents have the ability to think rationally, that they understand what's occurred and they need no further explanations. They assume that since adolescents are capable of independent thought and action, and they're often less open to adult assistance and guidance, that they don't need the support from adults at the time of death. But in reality, adolescents do. And they're often left unsupported when a family member dies. Services are almost always extended to parents, who then tend to rely on adolescent children to provide them with comfort and to take on adult responsibilities. So it's important that we provide information and support to grieving adolescents as well. I also wanted to talk about cumulative loss. Cumulative loss occurs when the frequency of deaths in a community or group are so great that individual children unfortunately experience multiple losses. And that's happening during the pandemic, but it happened in some communities, including in New York City, even prior to the pandemic. A common myth in communities with high rates of violence and death is that children and adolescents in these communities have somehow become accustomed to loss. The adults may not see many expressions of grief and just conclude that children are actually not grieving each new loss. Students attending schools within neighborhoods that have high rates of community violence, poverty, and deaths generally lack sufficient support to cope effectively with these deaths, and they actually become more vulnerable to the impact of future loss after every death. These cumulative losses are neither protective and they're not desensitizing. Children don't get used to the death of their peers and others that they love. Instead, children in these communities may come to learn that adults are not generally going to provide supportive services after a death has occurred, or they may view adults in their lives, such as those in schools, as being unable to establish a safe environment and unprepared or unwilling to provide assistance. So they may conclude that there's really just no value in seeking such assistance, and they may appear to show no reactions after death has happened. Their failure to ask for supports is not because they don't need or would not benefit from the support, but rather that they may have come to conclude that it's just futile to ask. So they may instead turn to their peers for support or engage in behaviors that just put them further at risk. Children who are afraid of dying from community violence, for example, may join gangs if they sense that's the only option available to them for finding protection. They may engage in risky behaviors because they are afraid of their own mortality, and they need to challenge the fears by engaging in behaviors they actually know are dangerous, in part so they can prove to themselves that they will, in fact, survive. So in this setting, it becomes even more important for schools and other adults in the community to make sure that we provide support to children. So let me turn to just a couple of points of practical advice about how to support grieving children, talk about the unique challenges during this pandemic, and then just open it up to questions. So the first is funeral attendance. People often ask, should children attend funerals? And I always tell people that children should be invited to attend at any age and any developmental level. You should explain to them in simple terms that fit their developmental level about what's happened and what they're likely to see. Not just about the physical reality related to the body and what's going to happen during the funeral ceremony in terms of whether there'll be an open casket, for example, but you'll also want to explain how people are going to behave, particularly in children who have social emotional disabilities or autism spectrum disorder. You might want to explain that there may be some people telling very funny stories at the wake. There may be people crying, and just to kind of help them understand what they're likely to be exposed to in terms of people's behavior. Then invite them to participate to the level they feel comfortable. I find it's often useful to appoint someone who the child knows and understands them as a guide through the process, someone who's not acutely grieving. That might be someone from the school or a babysitter or a neighbor or someone from a faith-based organization. And that adult can just make sure that the kid is watched and that his or her needs are being met. And that way the child can participate to the level they feel comfortable. If they've been at the wake for 15 minutes and they want to step out and just hand mask cards at the door or go for a walk, they're then able to do that without disrupting what's going on with the family. We also have to recognize that there are what we call grief triggers. And grief triggers occur both in children and adults. And this happens when someone experiences a sudden increase in feelings of distress due to a reminder of the person that died. Almost anything can remind someone of someone they care about. It can be a smell that reminds them of the perfume their mother used to wear. It can be the laugh that someone had that reminds them of their laugh their brother had. It can just be the teacher asking the kids to go home and talk to their parents about something, and that'll remind a child that their parent had died. I remember talking with one adolescent, and I asked her if she had had any grief triggers. And she explained she was about 16 or 17 years of age. And she said she was in biology class and they were learning about blood vessels. And the teacher asked if anybody knew what an aneurysm was. So she raised her hand and answered the question, but she didn't anticipate the follow-up question. The teacher then asked her, what can happen if you have an aneurysm? So the girl said she answered by saying, if the aneurysm is in a blood vessel in an important organ like the brain and it ruptures, the person could die. And then the girl looked at me and she said, it's not my teacher's fault. We're in the middle of a lesson about blood vessels. She doesn't know that's the reason why my father died from a ruptured brain aneurysm. She said, it's just ironic. An adult can say something that means very little to them without realizing how much it hurts you as well, or it impacts you. She wasn't at all upset. She said that was clearly not the teacher's fault. And then I asked her, has that ever happened again? And she said, oh yeah, actually today. Right before I came here, I was talking to my friend and we were joking about how hard the exam was. And I said, oh, I'm going to have a heart attack. And she said, and then her friend said, I'm going to have an aneurysm, and started shaking. And she said, my friend is a great friend. She didn't know that's how my father died. He died before we had met. And so the issue is there are many of these triggers. So it's important to think about how are you going to address them in a school setting. So one of the things you can do is teachers and other school personnel and family members can explain to children it's to be expected that these triggers do occur, and then develop a safety plan with students on how to deal with the triggers when they occur in school so children feel more in control and less overwhelmed by their feelings. So some helpful responses for these triggers include providing a safe space or location where the student can go, such as going to the school social workers or counselor's room, or just the library or classroom across the hall, or an adult that the child can talk to when they are feeling upset and want to talk, and setting for the procedures for the student to obtain the support without drawing attention when they're upset, such as a signal or statement. So for example, I know one teacher just left a tissue box near the door, and the student who was grieving would take a tissue and walk out the door, and the teacher knew he was having a grief trigger and knew where he was going to go, and he didn't have to ask permission. Now, we can make adjustments when we're in the middle of a pandemic if it's not safe for children to get up and walk someplace else. I had one teacher, this was before the pandemic, had worked out with a student that she would just put the hood up on her hoodie whenever she was feeling overwhelmed. They called it a hoodie moment. And when she was doing that, the teacher wouldn't call on her and wait until she put the hood down and was ready to become more involved in the class. So we can figure out cues that we can do even during the pandemic. School staff can also anticipate and minimize some of the likely grief triggers. For example, if you're going to do an activity around Father's Day with a group of students, what you would want to do is say, some of you may not have a father who's alive or currently living with you. You can still do the assignment thinking about your memories of your dad, or you can pick another man in your life who is important to your upbringing. That way we can all do the assignment. That will help people who are having grief triggers related to the death of a parent, but also help children who have either temporarily or permanently lost their parents for other reasons, like deployment or incarceration, for example. Caregivers can also help school staff anticipate other likely triggers, such as the birthday of the person that died, which the teacher is not likely to know. Or it might be that there was an upcoming science fair and the family member who died was the one who used to help with science. So it's useful to let the school staff know when you think there might be things that act as triggers. And schools can also make academic accommodations. It's common for students to experiencing temporary academic challenges, whether that's crisis or loss, for a number of reasons. And that may be due to difficulty concentrating, learning, remembering what's been taught, completing homework, or just demonstrating the learning on tests. These learning difficulties can occur immediately after death, or they might not appear for weeks or months afterwards. Pre-existing learning problems become worse often, and in some situations, new problems may actually occur. So it's important for school professionals to offer academic support early on. Don't wait for students to begin demonstrating academic challenges, and certainly don't wait for academic challenges to lead to academic failure before you offer support. What you want to do is try and figure out how you make the learning fit with what the child is able to do at the time. So there are different things that you can do, which I'm going to talk about if there are any questions. You can change an assignment. You might allow a student to work with a partner, or if they prefer to work alone, it might be easier for them to work alone. You might want to defer certain presentations or certain assignments until the child is more able to do them. You can also change the focus or timing of a lesson. So a literature class might choose a different book to discuss if in the book that they were going to discuss, there's a death of a character from a similar cause. You can also reschedule or adapt tests. You might give children more time to take tests or allow them to test alone or in a quiet location. And the scores might actually be omitted or weighted less if they were obtained shortly after the death occurred. What you want to do is find a balance between what the child can do in terms of learning and also how comfortable they feel. And you want them to be able to balance that with the ability to learn enough information that they can be promoted and be ready for the next school year. So it's useful, I think, for family members to know some of these options that teachers may consider to support children who are grieving, and also recognize the New York City Department of Education has actually chosen to become a grief-sensitive school district. And we're working on providing training on these topics to teachers throughout the districts. And thousands of educators in New York City Department of Ed have already received some of this training. So I'm just telling you some of the things that they've been told as well, so that you can approach them for some support and assistance. I mentioned that we have the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. That's the group that puts on the Grief Sensitive Schools Initiative. And this is the website for the coalition. And there's also free print material, and you can also get it in PDF format. It's available now in both English and in Spanish. We actually do have one of the documents also translated into Japanese, and we're working on translations into other languages as well. And you can download this booklet and order hard copies free of charge off of the website grievingstudents.org. Even the shipping and handling is at no cost because of the support of the New York Life Foundation. And then if you request the handout for this presentation, you'll also see a link to a YouTube video that's just a couple minutes long. And it's an interview of me talking about a children's television show, Mortimer Gibbons' Life on Normal Street, where one of the characters experienced the death of her mother from an accident. It was a sudden death, and illustrate how you can support children who are grieving. And this show did a nice job of expressing it. So I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions. And Jose, I'm not quite hearing you at this point. I don't know if you're muted.
I'm here now. Thank you for all the information. We have a few questions in the chat, folks. Feel free to add your questions during this time too. And I think where we'll start is talking about death and experiencing grief is usually triggered by something, right? It's learning that it's coming up, it's around the corner, or it's something just happened and it triggers us. What do you recommend around talking to your children when it comes to planning to have a conversation, or let it happen naturally where the child asks and takes the cue from the child?
Sure. Well, I think that, as I mentioned, children start asking about it in the first year of life, and they will continue to wonder what's happened. They might find an animal dead when you're going on a walk and ask what it is, and that's a perfect time to start the conversation and explain it. There will likely be some death that's mentioned in books or stories. It's actually in a lot of children's stories. Most of the films and stories that children have some degree of loss, and often around death. And you can talk about what that means. And so I think it's best when it occurs naturally. But if children have, for whatever reason, not brought it up, you can certainly bring it up with them as well. You could say, you know, one of the neighbors died from a heart attack. Do you know what it means when someone dies? You can just bring it up and have that conversation, usually in response to something they've been exposed to. I know somebody asked, well, what do you do if the child seems reluctant to talk about it? Well, children will often be reluctant to talk about something that you appear reluctant to talk about. So first off, just realize if you bring it up at young ages, then children will generally feel comfortable. When I was in training, I actually did a research project. I'm not recommending doing it this way, but where I taught a curriculum to pre-kindergarten to second graders about what death means in classrooms in an inner city. It was actually in Baltimore. And it was in a very high-risk neighborhood. What happened was I only had permission from about half of the parents for the kids to participate. It started with pre-kindergarten, 4-year-olds. These kids really wanted to talk about it. Like if for some reason I had to cancel the lesson or not continue, they were very disappointed. So there were like about 4 to 6 lessons that I taught, and they look forward to it because they want to talk about this. They become aware that it's happening and it's important to them, and they want to understand it, just like anything else, or sometimes even more so. So if a child, though, is grieving, let's say it's an older child or maybe even a younger child, and they're not comfortable talking about it, you invite them to have the conversation, but it is an invitation. So you have to wait for them to accept the invitation. Just stay present physically and emotionally and be ready to talk about it, and let them tell you when the time is right. I only would push it if you thought the child was doing something that was dangerous, like they were talking about killing themselves, or you thought they were a teenager abusing substances and were going to get in trouble, then sometimes you have to push it or have someone else talk with them because it's important. But in most situations, you just ask them and let them know that you're there and wait for them to accept.
So sometimes when we have like the best of intentions, we kind of might make the wrong decisions. Do you have any tips for course correcting? Or, maybe you went into the conversation and you started off, or you might have said something like, oh, I know exactly how you feel, right? Any tips for like course correcting, or like really like reminding yourself, like, this isn't about me in this moment, it's about the person in front of me?
So I always tell people that if we didn't talk to children because we were afraid we could say something wrong, then we would probably stop talking to our children by the time they entered school, and we would be mute by the time they were adolescents. So we are going to say the wrong things, even when we try really hard. And children forgive mistakes that caregivers make, if as long as they seem, genuine and they're trying their best. So I went over the things not to say. I've said them to my own kids. I've made the same mistakes that everybody else does. I think the difference is that I go back and I say, I said this. I remember. So for example, I once came home and my daughter was a teenager and she just looked sad. So I looked at her and I said, "What's up? You seem sad." And she said, "Dad, I'm depressed." And I looked at her and I said, "Dear, you're not depressed." And she looked at me and she said, "How do you know how I feel?" And I said, "Well, I guess what I meant was, I don't want you to be depressed." And she said, "Well, I don't want to be depressed either, but that doesn't mean I'm not." And she said, "You asked to help, and I don't see how you can help if you won't let me talk about it. So if you don't want to talk about it because it makes you uncomfortable, then I won't." And I said, "Okay, that was a mistake. I want you to tell me about what happened. I want to help you with it." And then she had gotten into a fight with a friend and she said, "Dad, I'm not clinically depressed." And I really wanted to say that's what I meant, but I didn't, because the real lesson was, I looked at her and I said, "You know what? But even if you are, I want you to always feel comfortable to talk with me. Even if it makes me uncomfortable, it would make me far more uncomfortable if I wasn't there to help you." So, I mean, we make the mistakes and we use that as opportunities to kind of do it right. And kids hear the wrong things all the time. They'll forgive us if we mean well and we try.
That's great to hear that kids are forgiving, because I feel sometimes as adults we become a little less forgiving. But it's great to hear that. One of the questions around here is around examples for cartoons or videos for children who are maybe 3 or 5. And I think you said something really interesting that kind of like clicked my light bulb for a minute. And I'm a huge Disney fan. Just always have been growing up. And I was, as you were talking, you said something about how many children's books and stories and movies deal with death. And it made me think, like, that's absolutely true. Many of the Disney movies that I love have the death of a parent involved or a missing parent because of death. But are there anything that you can think of specifically for maybe some of our pre-K um, uh, folks?
Well, there are a number of books that actually are focused on teaching kids about death by helping them understand it. And you can just go to the children's librarian, at the school or in the public library, or even in a bookstore where people selling the books are, not in department stores so in places where it's a bookseller and the people working there have read the books and can describe them to you. And just say, "I'm looking for a book for a 4-year-old to explain death in basic ways," and they'll be able to pull them for you. They go in and out of print pretty quickly, a lot of them. But I do want to say, and I think Disney is doing a much better job now with some of the movies where they do talk about death. So some of the ones that you see coming out in the past several years do a responsible way of explaining death in a way that helps with adjustment. Some of the older ones were really not very good. So I remember taking my daughter to go see Snow White when it was re-released. This was quite some time ago. I think she was probably about 20 years ago. And she was sitting in my lap at about 4 years of age. And I had seen the movie before, so I don't know why I was surprised, but I started, the movie started and I realized this is like really bad. So here it is, a girl whose mother dies and the dad remarries, and it's now a blended family. And what does the new mother, the stepmother, do? She wants to kill her because she looks beautiful. And so the girl doesn't have effective coping techniques, so she runs away into the woods to protect herself. And the stepmother, sends someone to go carve out her heart and kill her. So she ends up then running away. She's taken care of by some dwarfs. And while she is there, the stepmother comes after her still to kill her and tempts her with, this apple. So she puts a spell on an apple. I don't know why she couldn't use a cookie or candy or something we wouldn't want children to eat, they pick an apple. So she goes ahead and she eats the apple. And of course, the woman who, to fool her, she turns herself into an ugly old hag, because we should make children be afraid of the elderly and those who are not attractive. So what happens is she eats the apple, and then I remembered it, that she fell asleep, but they explain she will fall, or that she will fall into an everlasting sleep, and the dwarves will think she is dead and bury her alive. And I thought that's just such a horrible thing to say to kids, and is one of the fears that they have. So I just said to my daughter, in the middle of the movie, I whispered and I said, "Dear, I'm a doctor. We don't bury people who are asleep. We can tell the difference." And my daughter whispered back loud enough so everyone could hear, "Dad, it's a movie. It's just pretend. Of course I know that." So then it goes on that she is now in this everlasting sleep, but the dwarves think she is so beautiful even in death, they place her in a glass coffin so they can sit there and watch her while she's dead, which I think is just not a pleasant thing to do. And then this prince comes by, decides that she's so beautiful even in death, that he opens the casket and kisses a strange woman who's dead, which is not really behavior we would want to encourage. Then she wakes up from her sleep, decides that he has a lot of money and is handsome and powerful, doesn't seem to mind the fact that he kisses dead, strange women, and goes and decides to marry him and live happily ever after. I don't think there's anything in that movie that I would want my kids exposed to, but that was a very popular film. So please realize that when you worry that you're going to say the wrong thing, these kids are exposed to so many things that are said less well. I don't think a parent could come up with something that was that disturbing unless they put a lot of effort into it.
Well, I will never look at Snow White in the same way, Dr. Schoenfeld. So thank you for that. But also, I think that leads into a really interesting question of what do you do when another adult says something that you don't agree with or says the wrong thing to your child around death? And I mean, I'm thinking as a parent, this could be a teacher might have said the wrong thing, anyone at the school, a friend of the family. How do you handle that situation?
Yeah, so first off, sometimes there are different belief systems. So you may have raised your child to believe in heaven, and they might be exposed to a friend who says, "I don't believe there is a heaven, my parents say there isn't." And so I think at that point you can say, people have different beliefs. Once somebody's died and we believe they go to heaven, but they can't come back and tell us for sure. So people have different beliefs, but this is what we choose to believe in our family. So sometimes there are differences. Sometimes there are things that are just wrong. And it's like anything else the kids have been told that is wrong. That's how we deal with discrimination. That's how we deal with other issues where kids might say, "I heard X," and you say, "Well, actually, that's not true." I think I mentioned, the whole belief around Santa Claus. We did not raise our children to believe that they got presents because they did something good. I want them to be good all the time. I don't want them just to be good around Christmas. So we did not say that. And what I taught my children was that children receive gifts from Santa Claus at Christmas time to celebrate the birth of Christ. It didn't have to do with their behavior. It had to do with what the holiday is about. But what I then found was I went out to dinner and the babysitter told the kid if she ate her vegetables, then she would get something from Santa Claus. And I'm like, I spent so much time not raising her to believe that. So she said, "I heard," and I said, "Well, I know some people say that, but that's not what I believe happened." So you just correct it, without getting upset. I mean, I didn't want to criticize the babysitter, but I did use it as an opportunity to reinforce what our beliefs are.
You touched on something that's really important, and that faith plays a big component into this for some folks. And I think that there might be people who do struggle with saying, we believe a certain thing for what happens after death, and other folks believe something else. And I just want to appreciate that, like the answer you just gave is also helpful for folks who need to like reframe and rephrase some things and say, we believe, or I believe, not to like impose beliefs on children, but say like, this is what I believe, and say other people believe other things. And I just wanted to score that.
Well, I think the issue is that children will recognize there are other sources of truth in the world. It's best you let them know that from the very beginning, because then when they're confronted with something that's different, they'll come back and say, Mom or Dad, this is what I heard at school. It's different than what you said. Can you explain that? And then you can have that conversation. And if you can respect that people have different views, we need to teach that to kids from a young age. Otherwise, we end up like we are with political views, which are very different, and we can't respect that other people can have different views. So we really have to let kids know that there are some things that we know for sure, and there are other things that we believe, and people will have different beliefs and preferences. And while it's important that they understand our beliefs, it's also important that they understand other people's beliefs.
Dr. Schoenfeld, I could stay and talk to you about this all night. You honestly, as someone who is very like averse to talking about death, you make it a very approachable topic. Um, but also with us tonight, like I mentioned earlier, is Mary from the Office of Safety and School Youth Development. And Mary, I wanted to get you in here for a second and chime in. And I think for many situations, schools become kind of the foundation for healthy communities in many ways. And I think one of the ways that that's true is that in moments of grief, sometimes families might look towards the school to provide some support. Can you kind of guide the folks on the line, or let us know who you think is the best person to contact at the local school if you're experiencing grief or death, or you need some support?
Yeah, absolutely. First, thanks for having me this evening. It's great to be here. Always great to hear Dr. Schoenfeld. But yeah, so every single school in New York City, every public school has to have a school crisis team. So over the last year and then beyond, we've really made sure that these crisis teams are intact, that they are functioning and meeting, and we're preparing staff and teachers on all trauma related death and dying, grief and loss and trauma and suicide. So teachers and staff are equipped to kind of support kids and parents and the school community. So we have strong crisis teams. Of course, go to your school counselor. Even the principal or the administrator, and every single school has to have a partnership too with a community partner or a school mental health. So there's a lot of support within a school. You just have to reach out to them. So really the point of contact would be your school counselor or the assistant principal or the principal. And sometimes the parent coordinator is a great resource as well. But know that what Dr. Schoenfeld is talking to you about tonight, that's trickling into our school communities. So staff are hearing that, teachers and administrators and people who support the school on the outside are hearing the same information. So how can we support students better? And like Dr. Schoenfeld said, is like to be okay and just be present with kids. We don't have to have all the answers or the right answers, but just be welcoming and connect with students and our families.
Thank you so much for that. I think sometimes when we're going through crisis, we might not necessarily think of our schools, but it's good to know that our schools aren't just houses of learning. They're here to support our families. And really, I say this a lot, and I mean it from the bottom of my heart. The schools really are crucial to ensuring that we have healthy communities, no matter where you live, what borough, or if you're outside of New York City. So I want to thank you, Mary. Thank you, Dr. Schoenfeld, for joining. And thank you, everyone who stuck around. I know we're running a little bit over time. I just wanted to make a couple of plugs by dropping in the link to the survey in the chat. After this, you are going to get, as every time we have a session, you're going to get an email with 3 important links. The first link is going to be the link to that survey. So please take a moment to fill it out. It helps us plan, it helps us improve. And we would really appreciate it. The second bit is going to be a link to the recording for tonight's session. So if you want to share this with folks, please feel free to forward that link to anyone you'd like to. And also just share the YouTube channel with folks. The more folks who subscribe to that, the more folks who watch our videos, the more folks who attend our sessions, the more we can do with this series and the more we can do with this platform. The third link on that note is going to be the link to our next session. We're going to be back here with Dr. Wexler to talk more about cognitive executive functions. So please remember to register for that and share that information with any friends who you think might be interested. But until next time, thank you everyone for joining. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.